An operation for the Syrian Freedom Army kills many of the regime's officials, including the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, and Hassan Turkmani. Hundreds of soldiers defect from the Syrian regime and join the Syrian Freedom Army after the battles in Damascus. And Syrians protest in celebration to the Syrian Freedom Army's operation and intensify their voices until the regime falls. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. After the operation in Damascus, the Syrian regime took its revenge on the Syrian citizens by killing over 104 people, according to local coordinating committees. This comes along with clashes at the time are occurring right now in Al-Hajar al-Aswad in the capital Damascus. The latest lasted 4 hours between the regime forces and the Syrian Freedom Army, which is trying to take control over the security center. The clashes also reached the neighborhoods of Al-Asali and Al-Qaboon, where citizens came out to support the Syrian Freedom Army by shooting at the regime forces who are robbing homes. And according to activists, the security and Shabiha forces attacked the city of Madaniya in the neighborhood of Al-Qadam with guns and knives amid fears of yet another massacre being committed by the regime forces. These clashes caused the displacement of many citizens that ran away trying to find their shelter in other areas. The Syrian television reported that an explosion targeted the building of the national security at the center of Damascus, which coincided with a meeting of Syrian ministers and high-ranking security chiefs in the building. The explosion led to the death of the defense minister, General Dawood Rajha, and General Asif Shaukat, who is the brother-in-law of Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, there were conflicting news about the death of the interior minister, Mohammed Ibrahim Sha'ar. But the Syrian state television said that his condition is stable, while some unconfirmed information stated the death of Hafiz Makhlouf, the personnel responsible for the General Intelligence Branch in Damascus. And Reuters quoted that the people wounded in bombing were transferred to Al-Shami hospital after the Republican Guard surrounded the area. And this is the biography of Defense Minister General Dawood Rajha.
General Dawood Rajha was born in Damascus in 1947. He was appointed the Deputy Prime Minister and the Defense Minister in Adil Safar government, and he continued in office in Riyadh Hijab government. Rajha graduated from the Military Academy in 1968, specializing in field artillery. He had also done several military training sessions, including the Command and Staff Course and the Higher Staff Course. He progressed in military ranks to a general in 1998 and to a major general in 2005. Dawood Rajha held various military positions from a battalion commander to a brigade commander and served as a director and chairman of a number of departments and agencies in the armed forces and deputy chief of staff in 2004. Dawood Rajha is one of the figures responsible for the killings and repression in Syria, and his name is on the list of European, American, and Arab sanctions with 12 other Syrian ministers. And today he was killed in an explosion that targeted the headquarters of the national security in Damascus during his meeting with ministers and top Syrian security officials.
And as reported before, Bashar al-Assad's brother-in-law, Asif Shaukat, was killed by an operation that targeted the national security headquarters in Damascus. And these are the most prominent phases of his life. And as reported, we said Asif Shaukat was killed by an operation that targeted the National Security Council headquarters in Damascus. And these are the most prominent phases of his life. He was born in 1950 in the village of Madhala in Tartus. He volunteered in the military and entered the military college and graduated as a general who also has a diploma in history. In 1995, he married Bashar al-Assad's sister Bushra after many problems that occurred with her brother Basil, who tried to kill his brother-in-law. In 2005, he was appointed as a manager for the Syrian intelligence forces, which are a prominent force for the Syrian regime's security. In 2009, he was promoted to lieutenant and was appointed as a deputy chief of staff. That is until he was killed on the 18th of July 2012 by an explosion that targeted the national security headquarters in Damascus. Meanwhile, the Syrian Minister of Information, Amran al-Zabi, said that the targeting of Dawood Rashha and Asif Shaukat is an attempt to target the military, which is at the highest level of readiness, and that the bombing is the latest chapter of the conspiracy against the Syrians, as he claimed. And the death toll in Syria reached 104 victims today, while clashes continued between the Syrian Freedom Army and the Syrian Regime Army for the fourth consecutive day in the Syrian capital Damascus, in each of the neighborhoods of Al-Zahra and Al-Asali and Kafr Susa and Al-Maidan neighborhoods, which is under the control of the Syrian Freedom Army. Meanwhile, random shelling continued, targeting several houses in Al-Qaboon neighborhood amid a displacement movement. And activists reported that images of the burning of military barracks in the presidential palace overlooking Dumar neighborhood in Damascus. Meanwhile, after the operation that took place in Damascus today, hundreds of generals and soldiers defected from the regime's army and joined the Syrian Freedom Army, the most prominent of which was the defection of 3rd Armored Brigade of the Presidential Guard, which consists of 3 tank battalions that include 120 tanks. Meanwhile, 50 special units defected in Al-Qaboon, in addition to the split of 50 members from the air intelligence forces in Kafr Batna. And to know more about the situation on the ground, we speak to Tariq Saleh, spokesperson of the Revolution Leadership Council of Damascus. Thank you for being with us, Tariq.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell us the latest updates on your end?
Just now we've heard that the Free Syrian Army have downed 2 choppers in Tadamon, and the shelling continued on Qudsaya. There are numbers of casualties right now.
I'm sorry, Tariq, you're cutting up. Can you repeat? The forces were able to down 2 what? Tariq, can you hear me?
Reports.
Yes.
All right. Is it better now?
Yes. Please go on.
In Tadamon, we've heard that the Free Syrian Army was able to down 2 choppers right now. Maybe one of them was just hit, but not totally destroyed. Mm-hmm. The shelling continued on Qudsaya right now, and there is an increased number of casualties. They are lacking medical equipment and doctors right now there. Of course, the streets of Damascus are totally empty. No one is going out of their house. All the shops closed earlier today.
Does this apply to all of the capital or just specific targeted neighborhoods?
No, I'm talking about the relatively calm neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. What about the other neighborhoods? Is life going on normally in them, or are they affected also by the events that are taking place right now?
That's what I'm saying. Those are the neighborhoods that are away from the fighting, if we can say so. The other parties, not just like the southern part of the city or the eastern part, which is under bombardment. Of course, people are still trying to flee the areas, and as you said, we have heard horrific narrations of the Shabbiha and the pro-regime militias who went into those areas trying, in retaliation of the operation today, trying to slaughter people there. We still don't have confirmed reports of the death toll there, but the numbers will be really horrific.
Well, Saleh, thank you very thank you very for being with us and for your update. That was Tariq Saleh, the spokesperson of the Revolution Leadership Council of Damascus. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Nabil Arabi, said that Arab foreign ministers will hold an emergency meeting in Doha next Sunday to discuss the situation in Syria after the explosion that occurred at the headquarters of the National Council building in Damascus, which he described as an effective development. Al-Arabi added that violence always begets counter-violence. He also stressed that the Arab League will follow these developments with interest, as these developments might widen the circle of destruction and threaten to plunge Syria into a civil war that will affect the entire region. Al-Arabi also said that the only safe way out of the crisis is immediate response to legitimate demands of the Syrian people through a peaceful transition to a democratic system, which will give the Syrian people freedom, pride, and dignity. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel stressed on the need to urgently adopt a resolution on Syria from the UN Security Council after the announcement of the bombing in Damascus. Merkel said that a news conference with the Prime Minister of Thailand that this proves the importance of adopting a new resolution and called on all parties in the UN Security Council to agree on a joint decision. The French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said today that the attack on Damascus shows the need for a political solution to the crisis in Syria. Fabius said that doing this is very important, and it means that it is necessary and urgent to create a political transition that allows the Syrian people to have a government that reflects the aspirations of the Syrian public.
Dans lesquels cet attentat s'est produit, il est évident que c'est un acte.
And to know more about the political front, we speak to Afra Al-Jalabi, member of the Syrian National Council in Montreal. Afra, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Afra, can you tell us about the reactions politically and on the other part of the world regarding what's happening in Damascus, specifically in happening in Syria, specifically in the capital, Damascus?
Well, we're getting all kinds of news. Of course, it seems the assassination has been confirmed of several senior officials, especially those who were managing what they call the crisis in Syria. Of course, that has boosted the morale of the people. But on the other hand, people in the Syrian National Council and other analysts are saying that we need to also be cautious because we're getting also news that some areas are still being under bombardment. And you never know. I mean, if the regime has been cornered, then they would try to react in a very brutal manner, perhaps to survive in the last instances. So I think one has to really watch the news and watch the developments. But obviously there has been some sort of a threshold now in terms of the Syrian revolution.
Definitely, I agree with you. But what do you think should be the next step for the Syrian National Council in light of what's happening nowadays?
I think there have been a lot of discussions within the Syrian National as to the next steps, and there have been some statements. I think a lot of us agree on the need to emphasize national unity and to emphasize the unity of the Syrian people, and to also show support for the Syrians inside who sacrificed a great deal to bring themselves to this level of strength and really true self-empowerment when the entire world was silent and not helping enough and watching the incredible levels of bloodshed happening on a daily basis. It is really the Syrians that are freeing themselves with whatever means they're doing, regardless whether we agree or not on the means they use. But it is quite incredible to see the level of determination to free themselves towards a democratic state. And it is very sad to see also the reaction of people like Nasrallah in the region who are still standing by Bashar al-Assad and claiming him to be a pro-Palestinian hero when 2 days ago Bashar al-Assad's forces were actually bombing Palestinian neighborhoods right in the middle of Damascus.
Well, Afra, we haven't really taken a full idea of what Hassan Nasrallah said, but from what you're telling me is that there's contradicting reports from on your end regarding that.
Well, I just was hearing him, supporting and saying that this is a regime that has stood for Palestinians. And to me, this is ridiculous, because we know that it is the Syrian people who stood for causes of justice and humanitarian issues. And it is why the regime sometimes succumbed to that kind of discourse. But the regime actually was a regime of thugs that really was composed of individuals who were keen on preserving their interests. And it's not surprising to see them collapse. I think it is shameful for any official in the Arab world at the moment to praise the Syrian regime, because it's been a brutal regime that was bent on violating human rights to stay in power. So this is what I'm trying to emphasize, that these revolutions in the Arab world are about democracy and pushing these states towards states that would care for human rights. And so I think in moments like this, one has to stand by the people and to really make statements clearly about the violations of human rights that have happened in Syria. Even including against the Palestinians themselves. Palestinians were being bombarded in Damascus a few days ago.
Afra, how do you foresee the decisions in the next meeting of the National Security Council?
Well, the Security Council, it has been a source of disappointment for the Syrians, like the Palestinians, and as I was saying, we've been seeing double vetoes used against the will of the Syrian people by Russia and China. And, of course, the rest of the world has been somewhat, we have to say, they have been somewhat complicit when watching these vetoes being used against the will of the Syrian people. So, to be honest with you, Syrians, I myself included, we do not rely too much on the Security Council. What is happening in Syria is actually purely the result and the determination of the Syrian people inside Syria, who have been, giving of their blood and effort and losing their fear in the face of one of the most brutal regimes in the region. No thanks to international support or intervention.
Afra Jalabi, member of the Syrian National Council in Montreal, thank you so much for your update and for being with us. Coming up later in the bulletin, the regime forces increase their military operations in Syria. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. And after the announcement of the death of the Defense Minister Dawood Rashha, the General Asif Shaukat people took to the streets in demonstrations in Idlib, calling for freedom and the overthrow of the regime.
إدلب جوباس 18/7/2012 احتفالية جوباس بسقوط آصف شوكت ومقتل شبيحة النظام.
الفرحة تعمتل من ابتهاجا في مقتل داوود راشحة.
The pace of events accelerate in all cities across Syria as the province of Aleppo witnessed this morning clashes from the first of its kind in the neighborhood of Salahuddin and Hamdaniya. Also, clashes continued in the city of Azaz between the regime's army and the Syrian Freedom Army.
Syria's earthquake, as rebels call it, apparently reached Aleppo too. Clashes, which are the first of their kind, erupted in the neighborhood of Salahuddin, while heavy firing continued until early morning hours, after the Shabiha and security forces entered the neighborhood and launched a mass campaign of raids and arrests, as activists have reported. The clashes also repeated in the neighboring districts of Hamdaniya. Meanwhile, the local coordination committees pointed out that the regime forces entered the houses of activists and wanted citizens and broke their contents. This incident also happened in Al-Khudr Mosque and the neighboring shops. In the countryside of Aleppo, violent clashes between the regime's army and the Syrian Freedom Army broke out, while the regime forces suffered heavy losses during the past few hours. Most of the clashes pushed the citizens of the city to schools in neighboring villages and then to Turkey. The impact of the destruction seemed clear here in Raytan due to the artillery shelling, which included most of the villages and cities of the northern countryside. While activists said that the source of the bombing is the School of Artillery, Zahra Association, and some of the security barriers scattered through the roundabouts towards Halab Ghazi Antab Street. Developments are accelerating in the revolutionary scene in Aleppo after the events in the capital Damascus, while observers see that the revolutionary movement that Aleppo is witnessing in the recent months might turn into a conflict field that will result in the overthrow of al-Assad's regime.
The military operations in the city of Homs continue, where heavy shelling with rockets and artillery shook the city amid hovering of helicopters in the city of Al-Rastan, which wounded many civilians amid distress calls for help from citizens who are facing shortage of medical supplies. Meanwhile, the artillery shelling continue on the cities of Al-Hawla, Al-Rastan, Al-Ghantu, and the neighborhoods of Al-Qarabis and Jurat al-Shiyah, while activists broadcasted pictures of the effects of the destruction and the bombardment from helicopters, artillery, and mortar shelling intensified on the city of Talbise, where activists reported that the Syrian Freedom Army controlled all the military barriers.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
In Hama, Al-Arba'in district was exposed to violent campaigns of raids. This neighborhood has seen violent clashes between the regime's army and the Syrian Freedom Army amid the execution of a campaign of raids and arrests and the looting of shops. Activists had broadcasted images of the deployment of a large number of security forces along with the regime army military reinforcement vehicles. This was also accompanied by the spread of regime forces snipers on the rooftops of high buildings. Violent clashes took place between the regime army and the Syrian Freedom Army in Hamoud roundabout in Deir ez-Zur, resulting in the launch of a number of shells on residential buildings. In addition, Sheikh Yassin and Al-Jbeli, Al-Hamidiyya, Al-Urdi, and Al-Qusur were all subjected to artillery fire, heavy rockets, mortar fire, and aviation attacks. As activists reported, sounds of heavy gunfire that were heard in Nadi Al-Dubat Street. Coming up in the bulletin, the regime forces increase their violations in Syria. Al-Hirak city is being shelled by missiles and bombs in addition to other neighboring cities and villages. And heavy explosions took place in Sil and Ataman cities this morning, and several bombs fell on them, while activists also reported that 3 victims from one family were killed in Mahajja city as a result of random shelling and destroyed their house. In the series of daily violations of the Syrian regime, Syrian children seem to be the shelling targets, and the sanctity of holy places is totally violated. More regarding this we see in the following report.
From various cities in Syria, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network, the regime's violations and child abuse is only increasing by the day. More than 1,500 children were killed by the Assad regime forces since the start of the revolution as a result of indiscriminate bombing and in some cases through direct targeting and arrests. Moreover, many towns have been exposed to military campaigns, bombing, and destruction of buildings by the regime's forces, where most of these towns are located far away from the site of activists, hence them not being mentioned in the media, especially the mountainous areas of Latakia outskirts, such as the town of Salma. Also, the regime forces continue to violate the sanctity of holy places, which has been an objective for the Assad regime forces since the very first day of the Syrian revolution. Several cases were reported following the entry of the regime's army into the cities and villages of stealing the contents of shops in many neighborhoods, dozens of massacred bodies, the burning and bombing of homes, and the use of all kinds of heavy weapons in their military arsenal to terrorize the cities of Syria.
And before we end our bulletin, we remind you of the main stories. An operation for the Syrian Freedom Army kills many of the regime's officials, including the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, and Hassan Turkmani. Hundreds of soldiers defect from the Syrian regime and join the Syrian Freedom Army after the battles in Damascus. And Syrians protest in celebration to the Syrian Freedom Army's operation and intensify their voices until the regime falls. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching.